welcome. It is such a pleasure to be here. I am Brian McCann. I'm Vice Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very happy to be with you this morning. I stepped into the role of Vice Dean in September, and one of my most pleasurable duties has been working with the Persian Studies program and getting to know the Persian Studies program and all of the wonderful community that supports it, particularly Professor Farima Sadig Mostofi, without whom the Persian Studies program would not exist, and understanding that everything that Farima has done to build up this program over the last 20 years has just been such a service to Georgetown and to the broader community, and it's great to be a part of it and wonderful to meet some of the people who support it, all of you. And this is, I think there's tremendous momentum behind the program, and that it's going to continue to grow. We're at a favorable moment, and that we can really work with this, and that we'll be back for more events. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today Professor Janet Afary. Professor Afary holds the Mellichamp Chair in Global Religion and Modernity at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she is a professor of religious studies. She is a historian of modern Iran with a PhD in history and Near Eastern studies from the University of Michigan. Her books include, and it's a long list, but I'll try to keep it quick, Sexual Politics in Modern Iran from Cambridge University Press, The Iranian Constitutional Revolution, Grassroots Democracy, Social Democracy, and the Origins of Feminism from Columbia University Press. Co-authored with Kevin Anderson, Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, Gender and the Seductions of Islamism from University of Chicago Press. And co-authored with John R. Perry, Charando Parand, Revolutionary Satire in Iran. Professor Afary has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies, and has served as president of the Association for Iranian Studies and the Association for Middle East Women's Studies. She is one of the foremost scholars of culture, society, and politics. And it is a great pleasure to welcome her here today for this fourth lecture in the Sheikholeslami-Batmanghelidj Distinguished Visiting Scholar series. And I'd like to say that what we're seeing is the public lecture. Professor Afary has been here all week offering several seminars, and so this has been incredible for our students and faculty. And thank you so much to our sponsors of this wonderful series. So without further ado, thank you all and welcome to Professor Janet Afary. Gender Wars in Modern Iran, Have We Moved Towards Greater Reconciliation?
Thank you very much, Dr. McCann, for that very kind introduction. Thank you so much to, I want to give a special thanks to Farima Mostofi for your generous, helpful invitation, and it's been a real pleasure talking to your students and enjoying talking with them. And thanks to everyone who showed up today. It's wonderful to see old friends here, Manaz Afkhami, Azarjan, and many, many other friends. So my talk today will be familiar to many of you, but I'm assuming that some of you may not be that familiar with Iranian history. So I'll try to do my best. It should be about 40 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes. Sorry, could you help me with a slide? It looks like it's not moving.
There's just transitions.
Okay, thanks. In 2022, Iran witnessed a nationwide protest commonly known as the Woman Life Freedom Movement, or the Mahsa Amini movement, named after the young Kurdish woman whose death in the hands of the morality police sparked the protest. It was the first genuine feminist uprising in Iran and the Middle East. Also, unlike other mass protests since 1979, which have called for economic, religious, or political reforms, this one explicitly, and for the first time, called for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. In addition, the men who participated in the protest showed their willingness to follow the lead of the women, to even die for women's rights, as well as their own freedoms, something we had never seen in any Middle Eastern revolution. The Iranian government responded ferociously. The Iranian government is a predatory institution that rules through brute force and denies the dignity of its citizens. It's a state that has declared alcohol and drugs illegal and cosmetics immoral, yet enriches its coffers by illegally importing and selling the same products. It is one of the most oppressive industrialized states in the world, beyond even China, where many individual freedoms are allowed. Do you mind helping me? Okay. The state sees itself as a representative of the Prophet and the Imams on earth. It finds legitimacy in repressing its citizens, especially women, on the grounds that they're not sufficiently religious or moral. During the protest, the police shot into the crowds the eyes and genitals of the youth. Later, many protesters were raped in prison. Over 500 were killed during the protest. This was followed by dramatic executions of especially Kurdish and Baluch activists. Between 2022 and 2023, over 20,000 protesters were arrested by the police, though some were then released. There are no longer mass protests on the streets. However, a huge number of women continue to ignore the hijab laws. The government tried to pass a new law, hijab and chastity law, mandating stricter enforcement of the Islamic dress code, but has now, for all practical purposes, declared that it is incapable of implementing it. Why such draconian responses to women's desire to unveil? To answer this question, we need to go over a century of struggle for women's rights in Iran. At the turn of the 20th century, Iranian society lagged far behind that of Shia Muslims in South Caucasus, who by this time had lived under Russian colonialism for nearly a century. Middle and upper-class Muslim women of Tsarist Russia received an education in Russian. Shia Muslim philanthropists built private schools for girls whose families were reluctant to send them to Russian schools. Slavery was banned, and serfs had been liberated in Tsarist Russia. Laws against sex with underage boys and girls were on the books and gradually enforced throughout the empire. In Istanbul, social reform had advanced even further along. Slavery was banned, and significant social reforms known as tanzimat had taken place. A liberal constitution had been ratified in 1876, though abrogated later by Sultan Abdul Hamid. The first medical school for midwifery for women had opened in 1842. The first secondary school for girls was established in 1861. The first teacher training college for women was founded in 1870. There were also several women's journals and associations calling for greater women's rights. What about Tehran and Tabriz at the turn of the 20th century? None of these changes had taken place in Iran at the beginning of the 20th century. The institution of slavery still existed, though the number of slaves had dwindled. Upper-class men openly kept boy and girl concubines. Marriage with underage girls, some as young as 9, was common. In fact, both my grandmothers were married at the age of 12. Urban women had very limited access to public spaces. No elementary schools for Muslim girls, and no women's journals or associations existed. This situation began to change with the 1906 Constitutional Revolution, which brought the country a parliamentary democracy and a progressive Bill of Rights. Some leaders of the revolution were European-educated Iranian liberals. Some were social democrats of Iranian heritage who had lived or traveled in the Russian Empire, Tiflis particularly, and Baku. Under their influence, grassroots organizations known as anjumans were formed in major cities and even in some northern villages. Constitutionalists promoted progressive ideas such as women's access to education and the public sphere. Elite women formed women's organizations, women's anjumans, as well as schools, clinics, orphanages, and home theaters. No help from the government, they used their dowry to finance these. The 1906 Constitutional Revolution introduced the novel concepts of equality and liberty. Soon, conservative clerics, led by Sheikholeslami-Batmanghelidj, became enemies of the revolution. Nouri's position was that equality and Islam cannot coexist. He argued that constitutionalists were quote-unquote dishonorable men who violated Sharia hierarchies and purity laws by saying Muslims, Christians, and Jews should be equal before state law. He also warned of a day when women would wear pants and Muslim women would marry non-Muslim men, all true. Thus, his criticism were aimed at the gradual breaking down of the old hierarchies, the abandoning of old notions of honor and justice, and the introduction of gender and minority rights. Nonetheless, progressive constitutionalists weathered these attacks and established the principle of equality of all Iranian men before state law. So now I'm going to move to the Pahlavi era. The rise of the Pahlavi dynasty brought a new form of modern authoritarian nationalism in contrast to the democratic nationalism of the Constitutional Revolution, as well as a new era of gender and sexual politics. Can I have somebody here, please, to help us with this? The triple rights of the constitutionalists had been the establishment of centralized authority, modernity, and democracy. Under Reza Shah, they could not achieve the last goal, democracy, but worked to achieve the other two, a centralized state and modern institutions. The regime also implemented a number of reforms informed by the earlier program of Social Democrats in the Constitutional Revolution. Health reforms, clean water, hygiene, and vaccination became top priorities. Soon, many educational and legal reforms of this era ended public segregation of women and minorities. For the first time in Iranian history, open discrimination against religious minorities, such as Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, and Sunni Muslims, and even Baha'is, dramatically lessened. These changes were unprecedented and totally transformative. To some, the new sartorial, that is, changes, clothing changes, such as military and school uniform, a uniform dress code for men, or the unveiling of women, were outright scandalous. The educational reform, opening of schools in major cities, establishment of Tehran University, were viewed as a direct attack on theological seminaries. The new concept of time, marking time by the school, factory, and office clock, and the new calendar, all were seen as direct violations of traditions where the call to prayer and religious holidays had marked the time. Finally, the introduction of a new regime of sexuality, increasing the age of marriage, for example, for girls to 13, new emphasis on companionate marriage, were regarded as violations of the Quran. By World War II, a new generation of young urban women, many high school students from a variety of religious backgrounds, joined the leftist political parties, such as the Tudeh Communist Party, and campaigned for suffrage, the right to work, child care, and the right to be elected to office. So my mother is from this generation. In this time, particularly, women from the traditional urban middle classes observed a less strict veil, but the vast majority of modern middle class women remained unveiled. This substantial breakthrough of both religious and gender segregation in Tehran and other major cities was combined with a new movement for religious reform led by Ahmadi Kasravi, which aimed at making religious beliefs and practices compatible with modern sciences. These efforts, of course, infuriated the high clerics, and Kasravi was assassinated in 1946. Now let's move to post-World War II, the era of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The United States, under the Kennedy administration, encouraged the Shah to adopt some social reforms to neutralize the popular leftist sentiments of the time. The Shah introduced the White Revolution, saying his proposed reforms were far superior to that of the leftist Red Revolution, as it would be bloodless. In 1963, women gained the right to vote. The Women's Organization of Iran, with hundreds of branches of mostly volunteers led by Mahnaz Afary, turned women's rights into a national agenda. Once again, as in the era of Reza Shah Pahlavi, the regime co-opted some of the social and economic policies of the progressives, but without broad democratic reforms. Initially, gender reforms of this era had a limited scope in terms of the number of people who actually adopted a modern lifestyle. But the new media in this period, movies, TV, and journals, amplified these trends. The advertising agency propagated images of Western-style beauty ideals and lifestyles. Magazines featured provocatively dressed women. And soon, in the public's mind, feminism and consumerism became one and the same. Both were seen as propaganda tools by the West aimed at destroying the Islamic culture. Now, the reforms of the first half of the 20th century had been undertaken with an implicit social contract. It was let women be educated and go to work and develop the nations, and we promise you that they will remain dutiful daughters, faithful wives, and self-sacrificing mothers, even as they assume a more public role in society and raise a more capable generation of sons for the modern world. So that was the social contract that kind of had made it possible to make all these changes. But by the 1960s, this implicit social contract broke down because urban middle-class women wanted more from life than to be a dutiful wife. A new generation of assertive women affiliated with the Women's Organization of Iran, Parliament, and the universities breached this implicit contract by pushing for new family law, known as the Family Protection Law. Under the impact of second-wave feminism in the US and the West, modern urban Iranian women demanded economic and individual rights, including more rights in marriage, such as the right to work, travel without a husband's permission, as well as the right to divorce and child custody. By the late 60s and 70s, there was a crisis in identity. It was not only traditional clerics who disapproved of these developments, but also many nationalists and leftists, especially since the regime touted these changes in gender role as indications of Iran's growing proximity to the West. Many Iranians faced a crisis of identity, unclear as to which cultural and religious values ought to be kept and which disbanded. These were accompanied by a deep spiritual void. The public had moved away from the excessive ritualism of Shiism, but had not adopted a modern and more tolerant Islamic discourse, one that would provide space for gender and religious diversity. It was this void in both the national and religious identities that political Islam, starting with Ali Shariati, began to fill. So, moving to the Islamic Revolution of 1979 established a Shiite theocratic state with the goal of spreading its ideology in the region and indeed globally. The new regime was bent on reducing women and minority subjects to second-class citizens. This was a solution, they said, to the crisis of identity, return to pre-modern cultural and religious values, but maintain technical and scientific advancement brought by the West. Soon there was a dramatic reversal of urban women's rights, despite their heroic resistance from 1979 to 1981. In addition to abrogating the family protection law and enforcing the hijab, the state revived many pre-modern social conventions, such as easy divorce for men, child marriage, polygamy, but enforced them through modern means of institutions. In fact, I wrote a book with Kevin Anderson, which talked precisely about this, that he was wrong to think that it was going to be an era of essentially anti-modern. It wasn't going to be that. It was going to be pre-modern laws, but enforced through modern means and technologies. Now, Islamist policies towards women did not take root through force alone, although it was very powerful. Many women from the traditional middle classes welcomed the new educational and work opportunities the state provided and solidly backed them. The state recruited others through jobs and subsidies to poor families, and soon, during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, subsidies to veterans and martyrs of the war were increased. Remember, women were also part of the war effort in this period. And still others were lateral figures, actors who paid lip service to the Islamist order in order to achieve their own goal of moving up in society. The coalition that made the revolution possible included substantial leftist Islamists. These are people who, and their numbers were quite large actually, they looked to Stalin's Russia and Mao's China as possible models for Iran, with communism replaced with Islamism. As a result, there were some social and economic improvements in the first 2 decades. Women's literacy rates increased from 32% in 78 to 84% in 2021. Women studying in the university were now said to be commendable. About 370 campuses of Azad University opened up, and by the mid-2000s, there were about a total of 2,000 universities across the country, some in small towns. By taking jobs in revolutionary institutions, women gained financial and personal autonomy. As in other wars in other places, Iranian women who had participated in the Iran-Iraq War claimed that they were equal to men in facing death, so now they should be equal to them in life and receive the same benefits. Before the revolution, certain professions, such as acting and hairdressing, were castigated as symbols of Western decadence. These now became acceptable professions as long as the women observe proper hijab. For some, this embrace of these policies also meant a Shia Muslim style of modernity. Now, initially the regime encouraged increased birth rate and took away all forms of birth control and even banned abortion, but then it reversed course. Faced with an explosion in population, the government also adopted a comprehensive family planning program. In less than 1 generation, a unique demographic transition took place. Total fertility rates dropped from 7 or 8 births per woman in the 1980s to 2 births in 2005. By the 1990s, 6% of Iranian population was considered middle class. Small towns and rural areas of Iran became more urban. The age of first marriage for both men and women increased. The number of formal marriages decreased markedly because of misogynistic family laws. After 2010, cohabitation, known as white marriage, also increased. These are people brazenly living together despite all the laws against it. Soon we saw that the Islamist government created its own dissidents. Paradoxically, it was the Islamic Republic's accomplishment in literacy, health, and family planning, which really was a continuation of the policies of the Pahlavi region, but now presented under an Islamic mantle, which broke down the cultural divide in Iranian society and gave rise to a new generation of dissidents. Many religious families now send their daughters to high school and university. The increased level of participation altered many old gender expectations. Soon the dream of an Islamic utopia was shelved and replaced with a more sober understanding of reality. Many still held on to the legacy of the revolution, but wanted a kinder, gentler, and more diverse Islamic revolution. Now, by joining violent Islamist associations that control the rest of society, these young men and women from more traditional sectors of society who now supported the state were able to break their total devotion to their parents. The young rural women and men who were recruited into the regime's militia received a salary and many economic and social benefits. Many no longer needed the blessing of their fathers for marriage and began to enter into more companionate marriages that were blessed by the regime. By the next generation, around the year 2000, the new digital age, a life-affirming culture had emerged. Young people began moving away from the religious cult of jihad and martyrdom instead. We need a screen? Thank you. Despite all the attempts of the government to reverse the clock, gender relations dramatically liberalized. The mean age of marriage for girls went up, dating became a more acceptable part of life, marriage became more than procreation, and love in marriage became a crucial factor as couples expected intimacy and spontaneity, along with a greater degree of emotional and sexual closeness. The chart on the right is actually a study we conducted at University of California, Santa Barbara via Facebook, and we had about 10,000 respondents. And what you see here is the number at the top is the people who wanted love in marriage. Among the age of 63 to 72 is certainly less than 50%. And by the time you come to the 19 to 23-year-olds, is about 75%. Oh, thank you. So that's the chart I was talking about. If you look at it at the top, is the people who are in 63 to 72. If you look at it at the bottom, it's people who are 19 and 23. And in the 19 and 23-year-old, almost 70% want to have not the old arranged marriages, but a marriage that's based on love and mutual affection compared to the older generation of their parents, and their parents, certainly not before their grandparents. The 1979 Islamist social contract no longer held. Remember I talked about a social contract of the Constitutionalist and the Pahlavi era, which was let your daughter be educated and we let them be dutiful daughters and wives. The social contract of the Islamic Republic was a different one. It was, can we have the text, the screen, please? So I just kind of have to wait till it comes back. Okay, sorry. All right. So this was the social contract of, more or less, of the Islamic Republic. We will regain our sense of Shi'i cultural and spiritual identity. We will pursue an unrelenting war against the United States and Israel. We will become a new Shi'i sub-imperialist power from Lebanon to Yemen. We will enforce the religious codes of honor and purity laws, especially for women. In return, we promise you greater economic and social prosperity. But for a long time, this bargain has not held. The poor of today are much poorer than before the revolution. Being middle class today is only a matter of education and aspiration, not of standard of living. Farhad Khosrow-Khavar has actually called it a would-be middle class in that sense. That is, they have the aspirations of a middle class, but not the economic status of middle class in Iran. Maybe we should wait for the screen to show up. Okay. The theocratic state built its legitimacy on old notions of morality. One of its powerful mechanisms was to shame anyone who did not obediently follow the cultural and social agenda of the state. But shame only works when both parties are committed to what constitutes a shameful conduct. Today, the old rhetoric of the Islamic Republic as defender of quote-unquote morality rings hollow, which is why the guardians of morality, the pastoran, have lost all legitimacy, and the state can maintain control only through brute force. In the last demonstrations, when guardians of morality accused protesters of being prostitutes, they answered back, "You are the pervert, you are the vulgar, I am the freed woman. He's to'i, harze to'i, zana azade manam." These seemingly semantic articulations are not just releasing women and men from the shackles of outdated notions of propriety. They're indicative of far greater changes in society. So what are some of these changes? Secularization. Secularization has dramatically increased. A recent random government survey of around 16,000 people in urban rural communities in all 31 provinces showed that around 73% support separation of religion and state. In 2015, 10 years ago, it was about 31%. So that's over 40% change. Celebration of life and not death. Another important change has been a celebration of life, despite the state's severe persecution. The male cult of martyrdom, of giving one's life for an ideal, has been replaced with an exuberant feminine love for life, embraced by both men and women, so powerful that the youth are willing to die for the right to live freely in this world. Attitudes towards the West. We also see a less adversarial relationship to the West, primarily because of a support and affirmation which the protesters have received from the diasporan community. And remember, diaspora is no longer some abstract concept. There's a place where many of your relatives, friends, and your children are now living. Other changes are just as important. The generation that made the 1979 revolution believed that concerns with the body were bourgeois, decadent, and immoral, while traditional Iranian society believed that bodybuilding was exclusively for men. In contrast, this new generation celebrates the aesthetics of a strong and beautiful body, from skateboarding and wall climbing to bodybuilding and yoga and Pilates, to the freedom to dress fashionably. Sports are now a really big part of women's lives and aspirations. What are some of the other profound cultural changes that have taken place? Around 60% of Iranians either totally oppose the mandatory hijab or support unveiling. The definition of what is a good Muslim has changed in society. In this area as well as in others, there have been dramatic changes, whether it's belief in life after death, the meaning of fasting, or the definition of what it means to be a good Muslim. I would say there's more emphasis now on inner religiosity and spirituality rather than an outward religiosity, which is marked by ritual and observance. So the idea is to be a good person. In surveys, they say it's much better, much more important to be a good person than to, regularly perform namaz or even fast, Ethnic diversity of the movement. With regard to ethnicities, there's much greater embrace of the ethnic diversity of Iran. This we see particularly in the arts, in music and dance, because of the heroic role which especially Kurds and Baluch played during the movement. In conclusion, as with communism in the East, the Iranian Islamist state seems to have acted as a transition state, first by transferring the allegiance of the youth from the patriarchal family to the state. Then, when disillusionment with the state set in, young people moved towards greater individual autonomy and self-affirmation. The women's life freedom movement showed greater understanding between men and women, Shi'is and Sunnis, Muslims and non-Muslims, ethnic Persians, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, and others. The Kurds and Baluchis who fought for dignity and right, let's not forget, chose to downplay their specific cultural and sometimes religious, in this case Sunni demands, and instead pushed for a discourse of national unity with the goal of eventually overthrowing the despotic regime. Women also chose to downplay their specific gender demands and welcome the brave men who joined their protests. This does not mean that patriarchal or ethnic conflicts are resolved. It means people realize that for the sake of overthrowing the government of the Islamic Republic, they need to work together and not let these divisions separate them for now. This is certainly the first step towards greater reconciliation in the nation's entrenched gender wars, one that would hopefully also pave the way towards a more democratic and free Iranian society. Thank you very much for your time. Happy to take, yes, of course. Now, don't start all at once. Yes, please.
So, with the... Am I allowed to ask?
Yes, please.
Okay. When it comes to the enforcement of these hijab laws, does the IRGC and the Basij take on the same roles, do you know? Are they both enforced the Sharia law over there in society?
So the Basij is a part of the IRGC. They collaborate with one another, yeah.
Okay.
They're all, yeah, thank you. Yes, please. Oh. Maybe somebody else should do the, yes, please.
I know it's hard to have a crystal ball, but where do you see this going in the next chapter?
Oh, that's what we don't do as historians. But I think my talk has shown that, you know, you have going forward and you can get pushed back again, and then you go forward again and push back again. I mean, and I feel the same way about the United States, by the way, you know. We're in a really deep spot right now, and dark spot, but I have hope for this country too. Yes, please.
I was wondering how strong are the civil society and women, in particular, in Iran, in this era?
So the organizations are not able to function, like, for example, in the Khatami era, there was some degree of opening. This has been a really brutal couple years for them. But what I guess my emphasis was more on the way the culture is changing, dramatically shifting. And the reason I wanted to compare it with the Ottoman Empire and the Russian population, the Muslim Russian population, was to see where we were, you know, just barely a century ago, and then therefore how far we've come. Because a lot of times Iranians seem to compare themselves with the Americans or the French or the Germans, and that's not a right comparison. You know, we have to kind of see where we started from, and then see how far we've come. And we've come an enormous amount, you know. I guess I'll get a question. Yes.
Yes. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Afary, for this fantastic. It was very, very informative.
Thank you.
I do have a question regarding all the mosques that were built from 79 on. Mm-hmm. There was an explosion of new mosques. Everywhere you go, you see these new mosques. I wanted to know if you have any statistics on how they are attended now. Are they empty because of what you were saying?
For a long time, attendance has been, you know, people used to go there to get coupons and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a matter of religiosity. It was simply showing your face to get the benefits you were expected to get, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Please, in the front.
You mentioned that the definition of a Muslim is changed. So my question is that what exactly is that definition?
Right. So you see, Islam has many, many components to it. There's the fiqh, for example. There's customary practice, for example. People seem to be moving away from a fiqh-based, Sharia-based Islam a lot of Sufi movements have been gaining ground, both abroad and inside Iran. Sufism generally is a more tolerant version of any religion, you know. Basically, these mystic religions are to somewhat more accepting. They believe that the person can have a one-to-one relationship to God. They're not bound by, you know, of fiqh and things like that. And so, so I think that's what we see. You know, as long as death exists, religion will exist. So the idea that there would be somehow religion would disappear is just impossible. I mean, the Soviets did their best, absolute best, to get rid of religion, and it came back with a vengeance. So I'm in a religious studies department. I'm trained as a historian, but now I'm in a religious studies, and I've learned quite a bit in the last decade or so since I've been in this department, which is that the biggest guarantee for democracy and plurality is to allow for a plurality of religious voices, as many as possible, you know, and that's the only guarantee we have, so that, you know, people could find themselves in these religious traditions, but that also nobody could speak for the religion, you know. Nobody could say, this is the way the Christians ought to be, really, that there would be a plurality. And I think the same thing hopefully will happen within Islam. The reason I mentioned Kasravi is that he actually did quite a bit. He introduced the idea of Pakdini. I mean, Kasravi had a lot of problems with gender issues and all that. But he introduced this idea, and my next book is actually on the subject of religious reform. This is a long-standing idea. It started with the Babi movement, which initially was a religious reform. It was a Shi'i religious reform, right? I mean, the Babi leaders were clerics, basically, or had trained as clerics. And what they were saying is, let's get rid of the fiqh and have kind of a religion based on justice and things like that. Well, it didn't work out. You know, Amir Kabir and, of course, Nasiruddin Shah were opposed to that. So then you have a generation in the late 1990s, Sayyid Hadi Najmabadi, for example, these are free thinkers who are propagating these. In the Constitutional Revolution, you have Ali Akbar Dehkhoda, who starts writing about reforming religion. One of my books is about that subject. And then as you move further in the 40s, you have Qom. In Qom, you have clerics who start moving for reforming Islam and making it more compatible with sciences, for example. As I said, Kasravi does that also. So it's a revolving thing. In the 1990s, for example, a lot of Iranians began to turn Muharram rituals into a festival, which is what we see. You know, festivals are basically Catholic institutions and traditions that are made into festival, but the government wouldn't let them do that. Just last year, a group of women began Sinezani, you know, which is, so everything that you do, everything that can be done to make these religions more plural, more accepting of various gender relations, of ethnicities, of harmony with other religions, I think these are all very positive steps. And there have been people who've been writing about it also. The problem always has been gender. You know, the whole tradition of Islamic reformism, Surush, Kadivar, and so forth, gender was the red line. They were not willing to go beyond that. They were like, everything has to be changed, but gender relations, we have to keep it. It can't be done that way. Gender is fundamental to any religious reform in Iran. Yes?
Thank you. To follow up on what you just said, I totally agree with you that gender is fundamental. And earlier you said that even though the protests have diminished, women are challenging hijab laws. But then you said they're downplaying their gender demands towards the end. So
during the actual protests is what I said. In other words, they formed alliances with men for the sake of fighting this brutal government. And so did the Kurds and the Sunnis. I think it was quite interesting that although demands for cultural autonomy are quite strong among the Kurdish population and the Baluchi population, these were not the slogans that we saw during the Mahsa Amini protests. And I think it was very deliberate. So we have to take notice of that. We can't think that they either forgot it or they've moved beyond that. It's still very much there. My point is that to reach and to your question here, and how much farther do we have? A lot of work has to be done for the Persianate society to be more accepting of a plural ethnic Iranian society. People don't like it when we usually talk about this stuff. You want to call it federalism, whatever else you want to call it, but there has to be autonomy for Iran's minorities. Because let me give you an example from history. This is a little bit over this, if you don't mind. My first book was on the Constitutional Revolution. The Constitutional Revolution did a great deal, but in 1908 it was stopped because the king and the clerics joined forces with the Russian backing, and they thought they crushed it, right? So where did the revolution go? It went to Azerbaijan. It went to Gilan and Mazandaran in the north. That's where the revolutionaries began regroup, and it went to diaspora. And eventually, with the leadership of the diaspora, the Azerbaijani fighters, and it became an international force because soon you had Georgian and Armenians also coming in, and the people of Gilan and Mazandaran, and the Bakhtiyari tribes from the south, they all came and they took over the capital city. That's how the constitutional revolution came back. That's how we have it. So let's look at history, in other words, at examples we've had when a very progressive movement has been crushed, and then how has it come back? And this is how it has come back. Now, one thing that happened, which was quite tragic, in 1947, was when Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi not only just reclaimed the autonomy of Iran and pushed back the democratic movement in Azerbaijan and the democratic movement. You know that there were democratic movements formed when Iran was occupied by the Soviet Union during World War II. In that period, the Azerbaijanis and the Kurds, who had their ethnic demands, began to call for autonomy. The Soviet government supported them with the idea that they would basically carve out this section. So we went to the UN, and the Truman administration ended up supporting Iran, and the Soviets moved out in return for advantages they were getting in China and East Europe. But then what happened was that the Pahlavi government just crushed this movement, this ethnic movement in Azerbaijan and in Kurdistan. And to me, that was the biggest mistake of all, because then you see 1953 coup happens. Why is the 1953 coup happen so easily? You know, the United States spent about $50,000, I think, which is a lot maybe then, but it's not that much. Where were people? How didn't they come back? How come we didn't regain the Mossadegh reform movement? Because the Azerbaijanis and the Kurds and the others didn't come out, because they had been crushed, right? So, if we want to gain Iran back from the Islamic Republic, we need to encourage a multi-ethnic Iran. And we have to see that this future Iranian society cannot be a Persianate society. 46 years now has gone on. A Persianite Shi'i-dominated society, it cannot be. It has to be accepting of these ethnicities of itself, and hopefully hope that it would not mean separation. But the only guarantee you have for not separation is that you have a really democratic society that would recognize these. Sometimes what I say is considered outrageous by some Iranian colleagues and friends, but I think I have to say it as a historian. Yes, please. In the back.
Sorry, Doctor. Thank you so much. I wanted to follow up on this last point that you made. I'm Kurdish speaking, Kurdish Persian actually, and then I grew up in the Kurdish province of Kurdistan in Iran, where there were no language rights basically to education, so in Kurdish at all. So I want to see, looking not only at the Iranian context, but also the diaspora, this nervousness and fear or dichotomy of you're a separatist once you start arguing and making a case for that national identity being very diverse. And actually, as a person who's from a linguistics background, I want to plug in the importance of linguistic diversity in the social scene, and how there's really not much work done at all on building on the languages that you have as part of the national identity, basically. So I know that in the diaspora there is that clash, between the moment you talk, you're a separatist, or you have to talk about the national identity if you want to be part of basically that discourse. So How do you see, from your perspective as a historian, sociologist, how do you reconcile these two? What are some of the educational groundwork, foundational work that we need to do on language diversity, not only culture?
Yes, thank you very much for your comments. I think what we need to do is to make this literature work on a trilingual kind of a concept. Kurdish literature can be translated into English and made available to Persian speakers, for example. Baluchi literature also. I think we need to work on that in the same way that we worked on making Persian literary work available to an American audience. We need to think of ourselves as a multi-ethnic country with these multi-ethnic identities and have literature awards, for example, for the best short story in Baluch, the best short story in Kurdish, but then publish it in like 3 languages. We have those capabilities now. I mean, it's a lot easier than when we first started doing things like that. But we have to sort of start to think as a multi-ethnic Iranian society, is what I'm trying to say, and have the input of people like yourself, because certainly I can only say so much, but the input really has to come from people in the region. Question over here, yes.
You had mentioned, when you talked about how Iran was really kind of delayed on moving forward with the reforms for women's rights. I wonder, what do you think was the reason for that? What was it about Iranian society or culture that had them sort of held back in that way? And especially given Iran's much past history, like more ancient history of, protecting people's rights and looking at, human rights being equal.
Oh, that will take a long time to explain. If I want to summarize it, it's probably begins with the establishment of the Safavid dynasty and creating a Shia theocratic state. This is not the first time we have a Shia theocracy. We also had it. Remember, Iran was predominantly Sunni until the Safavid dynasty established itself in Iran. The clerics became very powerful. The clerics had money. They were collecting taxes. They were actually breaking down printing presses because copying stuff was, as in every religion, by the way, this has been, the printing press has been really a liberator of nationalities throughout Europe, and we commonly talk about it, how the printing press made it possible for people to print their religious texts and then be able to translate it in their dialect also, and then that usually becomes the concept around which new democratic ideas, first new nationalities and then new democratic ideas form. So when you have a country that's dominated by the clerical establishment, the Sharia law is the dominant form, and it doesn't allow for printing press to come in, so that really means that you fall behind. I would say that was probably number one, yeah. Yes?
Talking about multi-ethnic Iran, I think you mentioned some convergence between the Sunni and Shia during the movement. Are there significant differences in how gender demands are viewed by Sunni versus Shia ethnic minorities?
They're not necessarily, the Sunni communities are not necessarily better on women. They actually sometimes are worse. So for example, we do hear of FGM, female genital mutilation, among some Kurds, for example. And in Baluchistan, of course, polygamy is quite rampant, So this is another reason why women's rights and feminism can be the glue that can connect this nation together. You see, if women become leaders, feminist leaders become leader of the Iranian movement, and they appeal to the Baluchis and the Kurdish women, why would they want to separate if they're going to end up with some authoritarian, misogynistic government, if they can be part of an Iranian society that's much more open with regard to gender rights? See what I mean? So these are the kind of things we have to start thinking about, that it's not just a nice thing to put women in leadership. It actually is a matter of survival for Iranian society to be able to keep it together, because we have a really robust, despite everything that the government of Islamic Republic has done, feminist movement in Iran. Publication is surreal. Hundreds of books are coming out, the novels that I can't keep up. I mean, I read this stuff and I cannot possibly keep up, you're right? So in every way, understanding of homosexuality, for example, has become much more accepting Iranian society than it was before. So these are all the areas in which I think we can have a multi-ethnic discourse, but it needs money and funding. It needs people to help us reach out to the Baluchis, understand who are some of the women activists there, make it possible for them to be able to perhaps give them funding or grant or something like that, help them become more familiar with the kind of issues that they want, and then help them articulate their issues now in their own language, because it has to be done by themselves in their communities. Okay, yes, please.
I just wanted to know how organized this women's movement is in Iran, and is there a leader, several leaders? Are they united in the movement?
You see, one of the reasons the feminist movement in the United States has survived is that it's never had one leader. It was completely decentralized. So it's not like you can end it in Massachusetts. I mean, Massachusetts is not a good example, but Mississippi, and then, have it elsewhere. I mean, think about the fact that, for example, abortion has become illegal in 20-something states, and yet it's continuing, and these blue states are helping their women in the red states. So that's the power of feminism, is that it's diffused. And that's the way it's become in Iran. So there are multiple writers, women publishers, feminist publishers, women who have been active in NGOs, academics. All of these are part of the leadership of the feminist movement, and that's its strength, because it cannot really be crushed for this very reason. And we don't even want it to have like one leader, because obviously they will execute him, right? Yes. How much time do we have here in terms of? Oh, it's 1 o'clock already. Wow. So that's the last question. I think I was told to finish before 1.
I appreciated your
Please.
interactions, but how about the religious minorities? Because as we all know, Iran is not all about Muslims. There were also some Armenians and some Jewish people who lived there for thousands of years. In fact, some of my best friends in high school were Jewish. Mm-hmm. So what happens to their identity and their, when you talk about, ethnicity, what's their role and, how they're surviving this situation?
Unfortunately, the ethnic religious minorities of Iran are much less today. It's about a couple thousand, maybe 10,000 Jews left. I know because I am from the Jewish community of Iran. Armenians also very small. The Zoroastrians there are Zoroastrians in Iran still, but very small. Baha'is, of course, as you know, are the most persecuted in Iran. So absolutely, of course, any kind of religious reform in Iran would be one that would be open and accepting of course, Iran's religious minorities, right? Yeah. Last question, okay. Yes.
Am I the last question? Sorry.
I think so.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for squeezing, more than 100 years of history into a very nice presentation. I have 3 points. If you don't mind, I will raise them. First of all, thank you for mentioning that Iran, at the time, 100 or whatever, more than 100 years ago, was so much behind its peers. Let's put it this way, peers. If we consider the Ottoman Empire as being a peer, but then I think that we Iranians sometimes pride ourselves to say, and probably it's working negatively, that the Shah gave Iranian women the right to vote ahead of Switzerland, which is actually yes, it is true, but it is not really true in the sense that we Iranian women received the right to vote much later than many countries around us. Pakistan in 1947, Turkey in 1934, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, they all had received, the right to vote. I think what was really revolutionary was the family planning law that really changed the dynamics within the society. Having said that, I also would like to this is my second point, to say that we probably romanticize a little bit the constitutional revolution in terms of democracy and the fact that, we should have become a democracy after that. When you look again around around Iran, there is not a single democracy, even 100 years or 200 years later. Not a single country has been able to have a democracy. So in a way, we are from that same, I would say, fiber of culture and legacy or heritage, as you may want to call it. So that but we always refer back to the Constitutional Revolution as we should have become a democracy because we had the Constitutional Revolution, and we in a way.
I don't think it's a question of we should have. I think it's a question that is a part of our history, and that we really haven't known about it.
Yes,
that's what it really is. I mean, we need to know our own history.
Yes, definitely. I agree with you that it was a very important movement. But the society was not ready, and again, the society around us has not been ready either. So, in other words,
remember, the Iranians did not destroy the Constitutional Revolution. It was the Russians and basically the British who decided to put an end to it. So, who knows how many more years it would have had life in it to be able to continue. I agree, there would have been backlashes and so forth because the opposition was fierce. But it wasn't the Iranian people who put it down.
No, but in the sense that, they say that, Reza Shah destroyed it, or Mohammad Reza Shah destroyed it, because we haven't had, even within the families. I mean, I'm happy that you're saying that, patriarchy is declining. We are coming from a society where the top-down was always the mode, the norm. So I want just to mention the last point about the number of mosques that have been created. A couple of days ago, there was this article, or there was this thing that came across of how many imamzades have been. 8,000 something, 8,200 something imamzades have been created since the revolution. Now, mosques are different than imamzadeh because imamzadehs really get into the, khurafat and the kind of the superstition. It seems to me that Iranians are moving in two directions, becoming very bipolar. The one group is being very, I would say, negatively religious or compliant with religion, and the other side is becoming very modern. And probably this is the question that I wanted to pose. Sorry, it took a long time to come to my question, that we are becoming a very sort of like, again, a bipolar society in many ways. And thank you again for this really very wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming in, and I appreciate it.